Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you guys with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Okay, happy Monday everybody. Let's start as we normally do with the economy. Over the weekend, on Saturday, top regulatory bodies, the People's Bank of China, China's central bank, and the China Banking and Insurance Regulatory Commission announced new, much tighter risk management requirements on banks, a move that once again signals that regulators are increasingly concerned for the health of the banking sector. The rules kick in from the 1st of July and require banks to classify assets into 5 categories, ranging from normal to loss. We should view this move within the wider context of post-COVID China. Since reopening, Beijing has pushed banks to increase lending and bond purchases to shore up growth. In January, new bank loans jumped to almost 5 trillion yuan, $720 billion, a record, but a surge driven by political direction, not commercial prudence. The intention of the new rules is to reduce balance sheet risk and help, quote, commercial banks evaluate credit risks more accurately and reflect the true quality of their financial assets, end quote. Some commentators have expressed criticism of the move, however, saying the illness is serious, but regulators are erroneous in their diagnosis and treatment. Quote, Beijing wants to impose tighter regulations on the Chinese banking system to help banks manage and reduce balance sheet risk. But I don't think the mess in the banking system was really caused by poor risk management. Beijing has tried many times before to rein in rising fragility in the banking system without much success, and it will have no more success this time around. The problem, both then and now, is not with sloppy bankers, but rather with the development model itself. China has a highly administered banking system in which the extent and direction of credit expansion is determined almost wholly by the need to achieve economic growth targets that exceed what Beijing recognizes as high-quality growth. End quote. We have explored this phenomenon in depth in previous videos. Pettis continues by expressing that this has required and still requires substantial non-productive investment in property and infrastructure, which in turn must cause debt to rise faster than the associated increase in the economy's debt servicing capacity. Quote, bad debt within the system, in other words, must rise as long as Beijing is determined to generate GDP growth rates much above 2 to 3%, and all it can do through changes in its regulatory framework is determine where this bad debt shows up. It cannot prevent the bad debt. This is the contradiction it has tried unsuccessfully to resolve over the past decade. It wants to reduce fragility in the banking system without changing the development model that creates that very same fragility. End quote. He concludes by warning, quote, but as we have seen in all the historical precedents, including Brazil in the 1960s and 1970s, and Japan in the 1980s, it is the growth model itself that generates the surging debt burden until they choose or are forced to abandon the model. Debt cannot stop growing. End quote. On this theme of a state-driven growth model, this brings us nicely to our next development. Last week, the so-called State-Owned Asset Supervision and Administration Commission of the State Council issued its directives for investment priorities for centrally run SOEs for 2023. The priorities laid out in the notice include, quote, focusing on key areas such as major national projects, infrastructure construction, and strengthening industrial chains and promoting enterprises to increase investment in cultivating and strengthening strategic emerging industries, promoting the transformation and upgrading of traditional industries, strengthening the security of energy resources, and forming a virtuous cycle of technology, industry, finance. End quote. SOEs are especially significant in the People's Republic of China, and understanding their prominence is critical to thinking about the Chinese economy from questions of fiscal revenue, productivity issues, and challenges to reform from entrenched interests. China has more SOEs than any other country, with state-owned enterprises accounting for over 60% of China's market capitalization in 2019, generating 40% of China's GDP in 2020. In that same year, total assets for all China's SOEs, financial sector actors included, reached $78.08 trillion, over 90 Chinese SOEs are listed as Fortune Global 500 companies. Reformers, both within and outside of China, have criticized SOEs as being highly over-leveraged, being structurally less efficient than their private peers, and in some cases deeply corrupt, with these reformers calling for more privatization to increase productivity and innovation. Conservative statists argue that the use of SOEs ensures greater political control and thus better efficiency in the implementation of policies that have non-economic goals. Some ideologues even argue that state-owned firms can be more economically efficient than private actors. In recent years, Xi Jinping's flagship economic policies of dual circulation and common prosperity, as well as his repeated call for SOEs to be, quote, stronger, better and bigger, end quote, have signalled that reform through SOE privatization is not a priority for Beijing. Indeed, quite the opposite. According to state-run Xinhua in an article last week, in 2022, net profits at China's centrally administrated state-owned enterprises rose 35.7% to 1.9 trillion yuan, about $280 billion versus 2020. Operating revenues increased 30% during the same period to almost 40 trillion RMB. Meanwhile, as we have seen, profits for the more dynamic private sector, which is responsible for 70% of Chinese innovation, 80% of urban employment, and provide 90% of new jobs, were devastated in 2022. Okay, one more important development to cover. Hey guys, if you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to hit that like button. And as always, anyone who can go the extra mile and help me keep this channel sustainable, allow me to continue making these episodes every day for you guys here on YouTube, Patreon, and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. Thank you so much, everybody, for the ongoing support. After a very bumpy few years, Australia and China may be seeing diplomatic thawing driven by bilateral trade resumption. The signs are optimistic. Last week, Australian coal shipments resumed after more than 2 years. Lucrative lobster and wine sales could be next. Australian Trade Minister Don Farrell and his Chinese counterpart Wang Wentao held a virtual meeting last Monday, the first trade talks between the two countries in more than 2 years. The already shaky Australia-PRC relationship hit rocks in 2020 after Canberra called for an inquiry into the origins of COVID-19. Beijing responded by informally blocking imports of Australian goods and non-essential commodities, greatly hurting sectors of Australia's economy at a already sensitive and volatile time. Though we should note in 2020 and 2021, Australia's exports to China continued to grow in terms of value, despite the tariffs, but this was largely due to the rise in iron ore prices. In 2022, the value of bilateral trade between China and Australia stood at $220 billion. Chinese commentators have called on Australia to show greater respect for their largest market and to distance themselves from the United States, with whom Beijing is in intensifying competition. However, Australia has a long history of close security partnership with the US, holding shared intra-civilizational cultural ties as a fellow Anglophone nation. Also, since the rise of the Empire of Japan and World War II, Canberra's foreign policy priority has remained to work with an external power to prevent a hegemon from emerging in Asia. As such, Australia will continue to work closely with the US as a security partner in the region. But while Canberra's friend and ally, the US, carries a big stick, perhaps now, under the new Labour government administration elected last May, it has relearned the Rooseveltian wisdom of combining this with speaking softly, an approach which, as we just said, looks to be bearing fruit, and not just for wine exports. Late last week, Australia's Trade Minister Farrell expressed optimism for bilateral trade. A few days later, on yesterday, he added, however, that his government will not be walking away from its disputes with Beijing at the World Trade Organization. Quote, "We have started the thaw in the relationship, as they would describe it. I'm optimistic that progress is going to be made in respect of all the issues that are now standing between us. These problems didn't occur overnight, and unfortunately, they are not going to be solved overnight. And we are not going to withdraw our WTO applications." End quote. The minister then added one telling observation. Quote, "I think one of the lessons of this experience is that we need to diversify our trading relationship away from China." End quote. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. Happy Monday, and I will see you all tomorrow.